Welcome everyone. This is ModX Sweden webinar. I'm Ryan Smith, professor at Washington State University, and I'm joined by my partner, Ivan Rupnik. Ivan, like to say hello to everyone? Once again, I don't think I heard you, Ivan.
Sorry, did you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Welcome.
And Ivan is professor at Northeastern University. We run ModX. ModX is a knowledge management enterprise where we engage in these webinars, take our research and others and try to disseminate it to the industry for the improvement of design and construction sector. In particular, a focus on productivity and offsite and modular construction. We are pleased to have this webinar today with two of our longtime friends and colleagues, Susanne Rudenstam and Helena Lidelow, both from Sweden, and participated in a one-on-one with Ivan and I that you can find on our website at modx.network, in addition to other webinars and network voice interviews that were conducted previously. Today, the agenda is that we will have a summary of those discussions that Ivan and I had with Helena and Susanne. And then after that, we'll open it up for Q&A. And you can ask your questions. We encourage you to do that in the Q&A function. It's at the bottom of your menu. It says Q&A. You can type in your questions there, and we hope to be able to answer those either live or even after by writing in answers and sending it out to the group. This will be made available post facto. We'll record it as we are right now recording, and then post to our website as well. After the Q&A, we will talk about an upcoming tour. We hope once COVID subsides and we can get out and travel again, Susanne will discuss that tour in Sweden that ModX and is being hosted jointly with Swedish Wood Building Council, and then we'll conclude. So we encourage you to ask your questions and pipe in that way, and we'll try to get those answered. So with that, I'm going to turn, let's see, hosting over to Ivan. Ivan, if you would share your screen and we'll introduce the topic.
Okay, thanks. Let me just get that started.
All right. The question, why Sweden? Why do we cover this particular topic for the ModX webinar? One is going back to the study that Ivan and I conducted for the Modular Building Institute, 5 and 5 growing the modular industry to 5% in 5 years, which occurred, which is great. And in developing that strategy, we traveled the world to look at different ecologies of offsite construction and what succeeds in these particular regions. We looked at Sweden because it has a long history, and some of the lessons that we learned from that early study a couple of years ago was that volumetric modular and panelization offsite construction really developed in Sweden based on a sustainable building strategy. In particular, the forest industry drove the change in construction with trying to develop a strong supply chain and forest to foundation. And double-digit offsite market penetration occurred in the sector. Higher grade lumber for automation. We'll talk more about that and look at that. 8-story lightwood frame modular construction was allowed by code. And that was a big change in promoting offsite and modular in particular in Sweden in order to make up that gap between, in the United States, what we have is a 4 or 5-story, and then what really starts to price out for mass timber at about 8 stories. That gap was filled by lightwood frame. Vertical integration of companies. We've seen a lot of that in Sweden and around the world. We're seeing more of that in the United States, whether that's actually companies consolidating and integrating, or whether that's them partnering in order to do so. And we'll talk with Helena a little bit today with Lindbacks, which is a vertically integrated modular company. Long-term planning for the future and appropriate levels of automation, and meaning not everything necessarily robotized, but where it makes sense and where labor is repetitive, implementing automation in the factory as such. Go ahead, Ivan.
Mm-hmm.
So Helena Lidelow is joining us. Helena, you want to say hello?
Hi everyone, nice to meet you. And I'm amazed that so many are taking their time to join this webinar in the middle of summer. So nice to see you all.
And we appreciate again, Helena and Susanne, especially in a time in Sweden in which everyone is off work on holiday. So we thank you for taking your time. We appreciate it. Helena is head of engineering at Lindbacks Bygg. She has a strong history in the academy, still holds an appointment at Luleå University, and over time has slowly migrated from academia to industry. And she talked a lot in her discussion with us about the product process continuum, culture in a company, module sizing, that bigger may not be better. In fact, they have a very small module size compared to the US module size in order to get some standardization in their product platform. Sub-assembly approach to volumetric modular, meaning building 1D, 2D elements and automating that line as a panel line and then moving them and turning them into three-dimensional modules as they go down the tack stations on the assembly line. And then modular as a closed system, meaning that as a closed system as opposed to an open system, it's intended for a specific purpose, for a specific project. Okay, next slide. And then Susanne talked with us a little more after our interview with Helena. Susanne, you want to say hello? I think you're still on mute. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, so hello everyone. Nice to meet you all, and many thanks for this great interest in taking part in the seminar today.
We appreciate you doing this. And Helena is a director of the Swedish Wood Building Council. Sorry, Susanne is director of the Swedish Wood Building Council. She talked with us a little bit about the history of construction in wood in Sweden and the transformation of the forest sectors in the 90s, public-private collaborations that are occurring, and sort of a market overview and a variety of approaches with offsite woods construction, including panelized and modular solutions, as well as mass timber and CLT. At this point, Ivan's going to talk a little bit about some of the learnings from those discussions, and then also some things that Ivan and I have gleaned in our research over the past couple of years regarding Sweden and offsite. Go ahead, Ivan.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Susanne. Thanks, Helena. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. Again, what we've been trying to do in our research is to both dive deep into places, but also really start to look at best practices that are global, right? And so one thing, to put it in context, something that Ryan and I tried to do a couple of years ago, is to understand the world through the lens of offsite construction. And so while in the US and Canada, we take for granted high wood market penetration, for example, in the world, wood construction is about 2% of construction. And so we've tried to identify markets and market penetrations based on a kind of construction culture. So the US and Canada have quite high wood construction, but relatively low offsite, whereas two other regions of the world, Northern and Central Europe, as well as Japan, New Zealand, and Australia, actually have high degrees of both offsite construction and, relative to the rest of the world, very high adoption of wood. Within all of that, there is a special country that we have to identify, which is Sweden. So Sweden has a high percentage of wood construction, like all three of the regions. It has a high percentage of offsite construction, but what's really amazing and very unique about Sweden for our research is the high degree of wood, offsite, multifamily, multi-story construction. That's where both European Union, Japan, as well as the US, as well as the rest of the world, really is behind Sweden in this particular place. And that's why we're very excited about Sweden, understanding how we got there. Another thing that, again, way to contextualize Sweden in the European context, but I think also valuable for the North American context, is through the European Union Construction Sector Observatory data. So that's actually some really good data that the European Union tracks all building products. And they have a category for modular products. They don't distinguish between 2D and 3D, but they do distinguish between steel and wood. So in prefabricated wood buildings, which includes panelized as well as volumetric, Germany is the largest by Euro industry, but interestingly enough, Sweden is the largest domestic market of prefabricated wood building products in the European Union, and it's actually fairly high. It's third in the export. So that's something to also put in context. We thought some of this data just to understand how significant Sweden is. And again, it's some very specific factors, but many of the things are familiar to us. Some other things, Sweden, like many other countries, including the US, had a significant offsite housing drive in the 60s. I'm not going to go into that in any detail, but it was called the Million Homes Program. We had something like that in the US, Operation Breakthrough. But again, a lot of the things that we've discussed, a lot of the changes actually happened quite recently in terms of the history of the 20th century. In the 90s, there was a big change in the regulation, and that regulation was not driven necessarily by the public sector, but actually was driven by the forestry sector. And then again, one of the things to put in context, currently, if Sweden has the largest multifamily market penetration, then by our research, the single largest multifamily volumetric modular dedicated facility in the world, certainly in Europe and America, is Lindbacks' new plant in the north of Sweden. So it's a really unique, unique context for that. And again, it's a plant that is not only unique in terms of technology, but is also ecologically unique in the sense that it's very much part of the sustainable strategy. The raw timber comes from right there, right nearby. And also, again, not only is that physical supply chain supporting Lindbacks as well as the offsite industry, but the know-how that Swedish industry has is the collaboration between offsite factories and industries, but also with the manufacturing sector in general. A gentleman that we met when we toured from Volvo was, for example, involved in assisting setting up the plant. So that's another important lesson. And here's Helena a few years ago explained to us the secret sauce to what makes offsite construction so great in Sweden, which is the quality of the lumber itself. Yes, it's technology. Yes, it's software. Yes, it's all kinds of management techniques. But it's just the quality itself. And one of the things, particularly for the US, which was so exciting for us about Sweden, is that Sweden is this strange mix of familiar and innovative. Familiar in the sense that, at least in the US and Canada, we're very familiar and we take for granted 2x4, 2x6 lightwood frame construction. That is not a typical construction system outside of North America, but it is something that is used in Sweden, and it's used in a way that we have not been able to do. So that combination has been very important for us. Also, another important high-level lesson that we want everyone to take away and we can discuss is the Swedish and actually global approach to volumetric modular, where panelization is a sub-assembly process for the volumetric modular industry. This allows for compatibility between software, between equipment, and it also gives a kind of unique flexibility to Swedish and actually Japanese volumetric modular that we currently don't have in the US, which allows both for higher standardization and higher customization. And that's something we want to discuss more. Sweden is also fortunate to have commercially available automation equipment from its own homegrown Randek, but also from Weinmann down in Germany. So that's another thing that we've seen coming to the US, but in Sweden it's been 20 or 30 years, if not longer, that a company can easily call up and get an appropriate level of automation for its facility. And again, one of the most exciting things for just affordable housing, housing construction in general, Sweden has been able to, using a combination of, using really modular advantages of volumetric modular, to exceed what we understand as the limits of construction in lightwood frame. So this is an example of Lindbacks, one of Lindbacks' projects where we see 8-story lightwood frame construction. And so even in a country that has also a CLT industry that's able to build higher, that's a major part of the built environment that lightwood frame, as well as volumetric modular lightwood frame can cover. Again, another important piece of knowledge that we learned from from Helena's podcast, again, is a really conceptual tool that Lindbacks has developed around understanding the relationship between product and process, as well as the relationship between standardization and customization, not as binaries, but as a continuum, where a company can find themselves and their own product platform within that continuum and understand and manage those expectations, both within their own technology, but also with customers. And the last set of slides, this is inspired by a webinar we had earlier this week, a guest preview webinar of the webinar for Sweden. One of the things that is clear also, and maybe again in Sweden is taken for granted, is the modern management approach to manufacturing. So offsite construction in Sweden is not just in a factory, it's not just that it uses machinery, it uses the kind of management strategies that McKinsey has pointed to as lacking in construction, and that we would, let's be honest, are also missing in offsite in many other places in the world, this emphasis on data, and on data as a material, as the key material for continual improvement and optimization. So here, what's important again is we see that culture, we see those techniques here in this photo in analog, and again in a proprietary digital format. And as we've been fortunate enough to follow, those techniques in an analog format are starting to appear in places like Bensonwood in New Hampshire, or in Connect Homes in California. So this important step to truly becoming industrial, which is really an emphasis on continual improvement through data, is something that Sweden has really mastered, integrated into its offsite sector, and that we think is a key, one of the many key takeaways. So these were just some quick highlights of some of the things that Ryan and I thought would be valuable for a North American as well as a broader European and global audience. But again, we want to now turn it over to you guys. We'll be fielding questions, and for Susanne and Helena, who are really the experts here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ivan. It was great. Yeah, we welcome people to put in questions in the Q&A. I'll kick it off here to start to get things going, if that's all right, with our guests. Again, appreciate them giving their time today. Some of the questions that we had posed for this webinar are centered around what we call an ecology, a construction ecology. And we pointed to some of the key factors that have contributed to this propensity for offsite construction in Sweden. But the first question for Susanne, anything else with regards to what has contributed to the growth of offsite industry? We talk about, Ivan and I talk about the change in regulatory framework, so it allowed for taller buildings. Was there anything else that the forestry industry has continued to do? And you in particular are working for the Swedish Wood Building Council, so I'm sure that you're in the advocacy area. Is there anything that you're currently doing to continue to try and promote offsite construction, in particular panelized modular CLT, in the market in which it competes with, head-to-head with concrete, for example? And what are you doing? Because we've noticed that partnerships are really key to getting this accomplished. Some of the people on the call are from agencies that can help to promote, in particular, certain aspects of offsite construction. So first question for Susanne is, what are you doing? What are you doing with the companies in order to promote offsite?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, Ryan. As you have explained, the offsite construction industry is very strongly connected to the wood-based industry, and we can see that the biggest driver for the moment now is really the need for less climate impact. So it's quite strongly connected to the need for lowering the climate impact from the construction sector, as the construction sector is responsible for somewhat like 40% of all the emissions of carbon dioxide. So just altering the material and use a greater volume of wood or substituting concrete with wood is one solution, of course. So that is quite strongly pushed also from our government in order to entering the green path. But of course also the need for a renewable within the construction industry is also strong. So we have the government in Sweden is actually pushing timber construction and the greater use of wood quite strongly, both on a national level, but also in more local within the municipalities throughout Sweden.
Oh, that's great. That's very helpful. We have a few questions that are coming in now, and we'll continue to ask those, and I'll try to shoot them in the right direction here. Our guests, panelists, Helena and Susanne, I think you can see these as well, so you can read them. We'll start with that first one from Allison, and I think I'll ask I'll shoot this to Helena, if that's okay. This first question is, who is the customer for multifamily housing in Sweden? Is it government housing? Is it private multifamily developers? Who's the customer, Helena?
The customer would be primarily private multifamily developers. And it's important to stress at this point that we often operate on a turnkey arrangement, also for multifamily. So we don't usually have a general contractor that addresses us as a modular manufacturer, but we do the deal ourselves with the client directly. Governmental housing is not a big thing in Sweden, but we do have municipalities who want to construct housing, and then we would compete on equal terms with concrete and steel. So it's not as though it's a stream that's designated for modular construction. We are always competing with everyone else around us.
That's helpful. This next question is, can you speak about the role of labor and labor organizations? We have labor unions in the United States, as you probably know. Is there any of those barriers in Sweden? And I'll first start with Susanne, and then Helena, if you want to add anything to that, would be great.
Yeah, this is actually a very interesting question, and I think this question will be more important onwards. We do have a strong labor or a strong union within the construction industry, and it's actually so that it is a different union, the workforce in the housing factories, and they do have a different agreement. So the construction industry itself, we can see somewhat reluctant view on the offsite development. So yes, this has been quite important also for the development of the offsite industry, the different labor agreement.
That's good. Does this impact?
Just for Helena, I remember when we toured when we toured Lindbacks a few years ago, you actually mentioned shifting from one union to another. Maybe that's a helpful way to understand those dynamics in a kind of case study format.
It's true. We have two active unions right now, and the rule in Sweden is that as a company, you are attached to one or two unions, depending on your operations. So that's the basic deal that's there. And it started off with us being part of the construction union for construction workers. But when we went from constructing under a roof, which is the first step you take when you're industrializing, and moving into making this into an industry and really moving to manufacturing, we switched unions within the factory, but we kept the construction union for our work sites. So that's the situation we have right now.
That's great. I'm going to offer some answers with regards to regulatory environment. That's a question. I think the question is about what's impeding offsite construction in the United States. And I'll very, very quickly, there's a lot of legacy baggage associated with offsite construction in regulations, and the fact that we're all different municipalities in the US. Each municipality, in effect, can interpret the code as they want. And therefore, there are some very friendly municipalities, and there are not so friendly municipalities with regards to offsite construction. But there are some efforts that are moving forward to try and grease those skids. Now, if we look at what's happened in Sweden, we mentioned just the extension of being able to use light wood frame at a taller height really opened the door, not just to prefabrication offsite construction, but to light wood frame construction more broadly. And it just happened that Sweden is moving in the direction and has been of majority of their light wood frame being some form of offsite construction, and therefore it benefits that industry greatly. We are seeing some efforts in the United States, particularly with the Modular Building Institute, to grease the skids on process and procedures with the ICC and developing a new standard. We have a video on that on modx.network you can watch to learn about that. But I think there is a lot of education currently going on with the municipalities in the US to try and educate those code officials for that process. So that's a little bit about regulation. Yeah,
but I
please.
think the question is also for Sweden as well.
Okay.
Which I think, so maybe I mean, I think some, maybe even for both for Susanne and for Helena, talk a little bit about what were the obstacles, like it's in the videos, but I think it's good to recap some of the obstacles in the 90s, and then what are persistent obstacles? Because there was some of the obstacles in the 90s would be very familiar to our audience, and then some of them were even greater. And then what are still persistent obstacles in the regulatory framework that you feel for wood-based offsite construction?
Yeah, I can maybe start. I mean, we since we had the change of the regulation, so we actually had the function-based building code, meant that we were allowed to build and to go taller and build higher buildings in offsite with offsite methods. But we didn't have the knowledge, and we didn't have any industry that actually could do that. So we had to start from the beginning really, and to develop the building systems, and we did that in collaboration with the industry and academia, and together also with some of the actually more local municipalities that wanted to encourage this direction of development. So that was actually the start to and we actually also went to the US to investigate a little bit and to learn on how you manage to build those buildings of 6 stories and more. And then it started by then. So it's actually quite a rapid development. It's only about 20 years since these developments started, and we now have this market penetration of maybe 15% when it comes to tall buildings, but buildings about 2 stories up to 8, maybe 12. We're going up to 12 now.
I just wanted to add that it's important to remember that there is not a specific code that applies to modular construction or lightweight frame. This is the same code that applies for concrete and steel. So when I say we compete on equal terms, it's actually very much on equal terms.
Helena, there's a follow-up question to your one about who's the customer. There's a question here about Lindbacks turnkey approach. So could you give some background upon that process, and how is it financed, for example? Do you handle all that on your own? Do you act as a developer? Do you partner with developers? What does that model look like? What does your business model look like?
No, it's a vertically integrated company in the sense that we have design, we have production inside the factory of modules, and then we have the assembly on site. And we also do the completion too on site. So it's a turnkey arrangement in the sense that the customer comes to us, here is a heap of money, give me the building, and it has to be approved to all the requirements that's there. So that's the basic idea. We never do any general contracting. It's always design build for us, and it's important because then we can control the design of the modules. Otherwise our factory would probably suffer. So instead of having external structural engineers and external architects, we have internal structural engineers and designers, drafters. We have external architects who do the floor plans, and then we cut and do the rest of the process ourselves. So that's the main thing, how we operate. And I appreciate the question, because when I have been traveling, I often feel that module manufacturers that I meet have this sense that they are not understood by architects. So our solution has been to just, organize ourselves internally in a way that we can handle the variation that's there.
That's helpful. Ivan,
maybe, Yeah, maybe one question for Helena, one for Susanne, and maybe you guys give you some time to think about it. For Helena, maybe talk a little bit more about the structural logics of particularly taller sort of 8-story buildings, and do you include other kinds of structural elements, glulam or CLT, or do you include concrete and steel? And then for Susanne, thinking about is the wood-based construction, what else is it applied to other than multi-story housing? Starting with Helena.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm a structural engineer from the beginning, so happy to talk about that. First of all, we don't do platform framing. That's important. We don't do that. So you have your floor basically, and you put your wall on top of it. I've seen the production that's made in American factories, but we don't do that. So our structure is a balloon frame. So I saw the question flipping by here in the Q&A, and it was, is there anything else in the building? And there is not. So we carry all the load on the timber frame. And having that said, it's important to remember that the floor plan can't have any design, of course. We need to have some wall and some attachments points for all the joints and for the racking forces, which become a little bit of a hassle when you reach 7 or 8 stories high, because the racking forces that comes from wind would be something that we need to take care of. And also, just for the audience, Sweden is not an earthquake zone, so it means that we would not need to address those kind of forces. Having that said, I've looked into the design of US construction, and I also see that it wouldn't be very difficult for us to handle that. It's basically choosing the right sheathing material.
And Helena, in terms of, Susanne, in terms of the range of wood construction, I know it's something you showed in your podcast, but.
Yes, the industry was quite concentrated on housing at the first. So, but housing, but also caring homes, and we do see a lot of lightweight construction, also modules being used in kindergartens and school and preschool, for instance. But now we also have the emerging CLT industry, and we're starting to see that there is a lot of other wood-based, more or less prefabricated, also in office buildings, commercial buildings for commercial purposes, storage, housing, etc. So and of course parking garages and other types of buildings. So the range is much wider
and wind
now.
turbines. And you showed us also some wind turbines, which was very exciting. Yeah.
Yes. These are the first ones coming up, and they are very modular, or they are modular. Some windmills, the first one are now being erected and put into use in the south of Sweden. Yeah, that's a very exciting development.
Helena, there's a few questions here that are sort of technical questions about Lindbacks, so I'll post to you. There's one about what are the size of the 2-dimensional panels before they get assembled into the boxes? And then there's another question about what is your preferred window? Is it a wood window, PVC window? Maybe talk about both of those, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. I'll start with the window. We don't like PVC windows at all. So it's an easy question. It's a wood frame, but we also like to have the wood frame with an aluminum cladding on the outside, because the climate is a little bit harsh on our windows. So we want it to be free from any painting that we would need to do during the lifetime. Having that said, they're also a little bit expensive because we need to take care of the U value, or the insulation of the frame. So our windows need to have 3 panels of glass, and at times they're also filled within with special gas that's not air, to insulate even better. And then the second question I have now forgotten.
Just what are the size of the panels
panel sizes
before you put them into boxes, and then also what are the size of the boxes? We have another question about that. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Our boxes is about half an American box or a US box, to be precise. You do something like 14 wide and maybe 72 long, and ours are then 14 by 36, roughly. And then that also answers how long is our longest wall, because that is what we produce in our automated equipment, is the 36 feet long wall then. And it's made, it's finished before it enters the assembly line to form a three-dimensional module. So we do the wood frame, we do the sheathing, we do the insulation, and we install every electrical wiring before it is assembled into a box. So we have a lot of prefabrication, as you mentioned earlier. It's prefabricated already there. So actually, if we wanted to, and we do at times, we could skip the modular step and never go to a three-dimensional box, but just take the 2D element and export that from our factory too.
There's a couple questions, Helena, about why did you go to the point of doing panelized and then going modular, because Lindbacks used to panelize. So maybe just talk about that history would be helpful.
Oh, yes. Yeah, we were panelizing our elements for quite some time. We have a factory that has been operating since the 50s and gradually becoming more and more automated. But then in 1994, there was a huge economic crisis in Swedish construction sector. And it concurred with the change of the regulations for timber frame construction. 1/3 of all our construction companies went bankrupt, and we needed to make a decision what to do, and decided to flip the cost structure. So instead of being on site assembling 2D panels and paying high wages for people being away from home and spending time away from their loved ones, we decided we need to move that into the factory. Our factory is in a very rural area, so the cost of labor is not that high, and move as much more work as possible into the factory. And then it was a chance. Let's try to do 3D modular. And that, I mean, it could have worked, and it did. It could have failed, and then we would have went out of business.
Yeah. And Susanne,
just to contextualize a little bit Helena's answer for the US audience, we take for granted the US and Canadian industries came from, whether we like it or not, from the manufactured housing industry. So we don't take that for granted, but it's not typical in many other parts of the world, in Europe and in Japan. The panelized industry was much more mature before the volumetric industry. It had to do with all kinds of other logistics. So we are the outliers in that way. In that almost all other volumetric modular outside of the US and Canada started as panelized and then moved to volumetric. We sort of skipped that step, and Ryan and I think that might be a problem. We think that there's some issues, and that's something that's really worth digging into a little deeper, because we assume that our approach is great. There's not much data, and we've seen lots of good reasons to approach it a different way, and that's for a whole other discussion. But certainly that, just at a broader kind of global scale, we are the outliers. And again, places like Japan and all of Europe, really, whether everyone's panelizing, and some folks are volumetric sizing panels. And those are not open panels, those are usually closed panels. Those are already heavily value-added panels.
Yeah, that's good. A couple questions here still about labor. I mean, that's a problem in the United States and Canada. And you've mentioned that it is an issue in your context as well. Both two questions here right in a row. How do you deal with the fact that each of these trades wants to be separate and have identity and have labor unions? And specifically, Helena, how have you how has Lindbacks dealt with that over time in integrating those trades into the factory? And is there a cultural challenge there? And then Susanne, what are you seeing more broadly in the prefabricated wood market in Sweden? And are there challenges with other companies having to, transition from sort of skilled workers on site into a factory environment?
So maybe I'll start. we approached that by way of integration. So we started with having all these kinds of different labors as part of the factory floor. And we realized that if you're going to be vertically integrated, this ends up in sub-optimization. So there is always one union who wants to have a strike, or one union who pushes the cost levels up, or wants the workers to have another work hour scenery or something. And that doesn't really work out if you're going to have a supply chain that's connected. So we started hiring. We started convincing the people who were working on our shop floor, come work for us instead. And once they were all under our hat, we had the discussion, the serious discussion. We need to switch unions, so everyone is now under one union, regardless if they're originally from one trade. So this is something that sounds, I understand, super strange when you're used to the situation that I've seen in the US, but it took us 25 years to get here. So it's a very gradual, we didn't see it as a shift. It's more like something that we have just done to make it work for us.
Right. Yeah, and then Susanne. Yeah.
Yes, and we can see that within the construction industry, there is actually a shortage of labor force coming up. So, and in Sweden, we have been solving that by having a lot of people coming from abroad to do the construction work. We have a lot of people from the Baltics and from Poland and also elsewhere coming over. But the long-term solution, I think, is to have a more I mean, there is actually demand now for having more of a Lindbacks model where companies are offering good and safe and secure workplaces, and it's also a matter of I mean, Sweden is a small country compared to the US, but it's still a country where it's a long country and it's a big country. So there is also a need for having job opportunities all over the country, and that is where the offsite construction industry that is often based, where the forest industry and the sawmill industry is based. So transforming or moving jobs from the big cities into the countryside is actually a good opportunity, and it's very well looked upon from the authorities also, and they are encouraging this development. So, and I mean, in the end, what we are also offering, it's a very precise quality and quality control, and also good working environment.
Maybe to Helena, and this is a question we've asked Helena many times too. Is there an interest in the possibility of Lindbacks starting a U.S. business, but also maybe, I know you've done some work yourself as an expert in the U.S. So what do you see are the pros and cons of that approach, and what do you think are the main differences between the U.S. and Swedish markets?
Yes, we have actually had serious discussions about starting operations in the U.S. and coming in as we're not a very large player if you look at us from a turnover viewpoint. So for us, it would be a huge feature. So I think we would need to partner up with someone to do that. And the pros and cons, let's put it just very simply. I've visited some factories in the US and I've seen the output in terms of number of modules. And something that often comes up is you make something like 2, maybe 3 in one day. We're at 12 or 14. So when we talk about pros and cons, this is nothing. I mean, you have a huge market. You have a very large infrastructure in the US. You have many, many factories. There seems to be some kind of doesn't really click when you're in your attempts to make that work as a manufacturing unit. And that is something I think that Lindbacks could really support with. If we do that as starting operations ourselves, or if we do that as an internal help to someone, I'm not sure right now. The main differences from the markets, I think, lies in both in the level of customization that we have. I don't have a catalog. I don't have standardized modules. I do not operate with a corridor set up for every floor plan. So those would be the main differences for me when I look at floor plans with US modules. I find them quite simple. It's a pretty straightforward project. This is something that we used to do when we started in 1996. And I'm not telling you that you're bad in any sense. You're just on a different path on your trajectory. That's the only thing that's there.
But Helena, that's such an important point, and we all have tough love for the global offsite industry, but we want to tell it like it is. And so I really appreciate that point, but I do want to be clear, because you don't have standardized boxes, but you have high degrees of standardization. So correct me if I'm wrong. What you've standardized are processes and sub-assemblies, and you have very standardized systems. We are standardizing, I think, in the US, we're standardizing the wrong things at the wrong scale. That's what it seems like to me, based on what I've seen. Because what you just said, you have more customization. Your plans are more customized than ours in the US, and yet you have more standardization. Your panels are much more repetitive. They have much more standard details. So we might be doing it wrong. It might be possible that we're just doing it wrong.
It might be possible.
Yeah.
I really can't judge it, but I see that it's different, and I agree with you. We standardized on a lower level. So
smaller scale, finer grain.
Yeah, on a smaller scale, a finer grain. So I mean, the reason for us being able to have a wall line that's 75 meters long and can produce a wall every 7 minutes is because it is standardized. So we wouldn't mess with that, but we can mess with the placement of the window and the door and the configuration of the modules on the floor plan. That is not a problem.
Yeah. There's two questions here, probably for Susanne, about forest management practices. And in particular in the US, we may not have the most sustainable model for forestry. And so there's a question, when we start using more and more wood, how is that managed given the demand side, and in that growing to 8 stories? That's a lot of wood. That's a lot of wood to use. And so how do you balance, the sustainability of the forest with the sustainability of the construction process?
Yes, a sustainable forest production or wood production is of course the key and really the base for having this development. And we actually also in Sweden had problems with deforestation 100 years ago. So we have a strong legislation. The law is from 1917, and it states that the biodiversity is as important as the economic output, and it's freedom under responsibility. I don't know if you use that expression. So that means that whether you're a private forest owner or if it's a state-owned forest, it's basically the same principles. So for every tree that is cut, we do plant at least 2 or 3 new ones. And it also means that over the years now we have a standing volume of forest that is actually growing every year. So we do cut 75% of the annual growth. So there is a volume of or 25% that is actually going into the forest production. So, and I would say that actually all of the Swedish forests are managed in a sustainable way. And we are actually exporting 75% of everything that is cut in Sweden. So for domestic purpose, we could keep some of that volume in Sweden and build houses from it instead of exporting it elsewhere. So that is one thing. But then, of course, you have to look upon the whole forest system, the global forest system, and make sure that it's managed in a sustainable way as well, of course. But the way we have done it in Sweden is like this.
It seems from looking at, again, from driving around in north of Sweden, that there seems to be, and it's not as, I don't have the scientific evidence, but that a forestry sector that makes more money if pressured by public opinion and by regulation is able to be more sustainable. If you have low quality export grade, low quality US, even Canadian grade lumber that is not also very high profit margins, not very value added, it's very hard to make ecology economical. Sweden, it seems to be that since the 90s, the shift from purely export to a hybrid export domestic market has also literally paid for a much more sustainable land management practice.
Yeah, it's definitely so, and also it's a growing interest from high quality lumber, from high quality timber products. For example, we are very active in China right now, and what we are selling there is the high quality and graded timber, the graded products from the sawmill industry with a very precise quality. Of course, it's a premium quality, but it's also very precise, so it can be used for the construction in timber.
And just anecdotally related to that, there's a question about, is there a difference between North American lumber used in our construction sector and the lumber, say, that's Lindbacks uses? And the answer is absolutely, there's a difference. And what we're seeing happen more and more in the United States and Canada is, as they use these automated machines, they're having to go to engineered wood or premium lumber and pay for that in order to gain the investment and the benefit of the investment on the volume side. So that's just a quick answer.
The quality of the lumber and the quality of the sustainability practice and the quality of construction, guess what, are all connected. So even Swedish lumber, as good as it's been, I'm sure it's gotten better because the industry it makes more money than it did before 1990. That's the reason that the regulations were supported by the private sector. So it's important to say, because we get in these conversations where people say, well, it's taken 30 years for the Swedish industry to change, but yeah, it's made a commitment and it changed. And so that's, it takes a first step, but that's what's impressive about Sweden, is that it was driven by the private sector, and it's been both. It has not been a conflict between ecological and economical thinking. The two have really benefited each other, as well as affordability and housing, and so it's a win-win-win to put it plainly.
Yeah, but it's two perspectives that always have to be taken into consideration. You cannot really do both. You have to mix them and find an optimum, of course. But I'd say it's also the Swedish sawmill industry is now probably about to change a little bit again, since there are high demand for those precise deliveries from the housing sector, for instance. The housing factories that now are asking for more precise products and products that are cut and delivered in smaller but just in time deliveries. The Swedish sawmill industry has been very much focusing on exporting big volumes. I mean, quality control volumes, but big volumes abroad. Now there is a change again with a more active demand or clients within Sweden.
In the interest of time, I want to thank all these people who are asking questions here, and we'll try to get answers to all these questions. Really good, insightful questions. I'm sorry we could not get to all of them. Here to close out, we just want to give a preview of what a tour might look like here in the future. As soon as COVID does lift, we'll make registration available. Ivan, if you'd share that, and Susanne, if you would just talk us through some of the things that we'll see when we go to Sweden.
Yes, really, we are very much looking forward to be able to doing this tour again. The idea was originally to do it this June, this summer, but as you all know, it wasn't possible, and it's not even possible to do it in the fall. So we're looking into doing it next year, next summer. And the idea is to repeat a little bit on what we did 2 years ago. So we will visit housing factories from the south up to the north. We will meet with the people in the fact that runs the factories. We will have lectures with them. We will have them explaining on how they operate and how they have been developing their systems. We will have factory tours and we will both have visits on CLT production facilities as well as housing factories that works with both panels and volumetrics. We will also visit some projects. And while we're doing that, as I mentioned before, Sweden is a long country, so we will be traveling together and make a number of stops at all these factories. And we will also have quite a great amount of time to also to discuss both within the group, but also with the people that we are meeting on what we are actually are seeing and experiencing. And the tour will end with seminar up in the north, up in the university, the Technical University of Luleå, where we will have a seminar for a day on this topic.
Thank you.
The idea,
yeah, please.
The idea, I guess you can join the whole tour, or you can jump in and jump off. Because it's planned to be for a week.
For a week, and please visit modex.network.
We'll hope as many as possible can join us.
Yeah, visit modex.network, and you'll see Suzanne's itinerary, draft itinerary. That might change a bit given when we're going to go, but you can get an idea of in depth of factories we'll visit, places we'll go. Thank you, Suzanne, for helping put that together. I want to thank Helena Lidelow, Susanne Rudenstam, Ivan Rupnik for joining here on MODEX Sweden webinar, and we hope to catch you all next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Ryan.
Thank you so much.